Hey everyone, Catelyn Moore here. And what I'm about to show you should terrify every single person living in San Francisco right now. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the tech giants that built this city into a global powerhouse are now abandoning it like a sinking ship. Not struggling, not downsizing. They're simply picking up their entire operations and leaving, taking billions of dollars, tens of thousands of jobs, and decades of innovation with them. This isn't some small startup shutting down. We're talking about Meta, Salesforce, and dozens of other tech companies quietly erasing themselves from San Francisco like they were never even here. And here's what nobody's talking about. This isn't just about tech companies. It's a warning sign of something much bigger, much darker happening in our city. A complete breakdown of the systems that made San Francisco the innovation capital of the world. So stick with me through this entire video, because by the end, you'll understand exactly why city leaders are panicking behind closed doors and why you should be paying very close attention to what happens next. Before we dive deep into this story, let me give you the full picture of what we've actually lost. Because the numbers are staggering, and they tell a story that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge. San Francisco wasn't just another city with some tech companies. At its peak, this was the undisputed global capital of innovation. The city that gave us social media, cloud computing, and revolutionary technologies that changed how billions of people live their lives. We're talking about an ecosystem that employed over 300,000 tech workers in the greater San Francisco area. 300,000. That's not just employment. That's families, mortgages, tax revenue, and an entire economy built around innovation. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where you need to pay attention. Today, right now, as I'm recording this, that presence has collapsed. Major tech companies are slashing their San Francisco footprint by 50, 60, even 70%. Office towers that were once packed with engineers and developers now sit half empty. The corporate campuses that symbolize the future are being quietly sold or converted into something else. Let me paint you a picture of what this transformation actually looks like, because the visual tells a story that numbers alone can't capture. Picture this. Market Street, the heart of San Francisco's downtown, lined with gleaming office towers. Each one housing hundreds or thousands of tech workers. Lobbies filled with 20-somethings carrying laptops, discussing the next big innovation over artisanal coffee. Conference rooms where billion-dollar ideas were born before lunch. Streets bustling with food trucks, boutique retailers, and service workers, all supported by tech money flowing through the economy like lifeblood. Now imagine walking through those same streets today. The lobbies are empty. Security guards outnumber employees. Food trucks have disappeared because there are no lunch crowds. Retail shops have closed, their windows papered over with "for lease" signs that have been up for months. What was once the nerve center of global innovation is now just empty real estate, hollow towers that stand as monuments to what happens when a city loses its competitive edge. And if you think that's just a normal business cycle, you're missing the bigger story that's unfolding. This is systematic abandonment, and it's accelerating. Here's what makes this situation so much more serious than just companies relocating. San Francisco's tech exodus isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a disturbing pattern that's been building over the past 5 years, and the implications are absolutely massive for anyone who lives, works, or pays taxes in the city. Let's go back and understand how we got here. Because San Francisco didn't become the tech capital overnight, and it didn't lose that status overnight either. This has been decades in the making, building pressure like a fault line about to rupture. The 1990s through the 2010s were San Francisco's golden age. Startups were born in garages and grew into global giants within years. Venture capital flowed like water. Every major tech company wanted a San Francisco presence because that's where the talent was, where the energy was, where the future was being built. The city embraced this transformation. Local government worked with tech companies. Infrastructure expanded to accommodate growth. The economy boomed. Tax revenues soared. San Francisco was the envy of cities worldwide, but something started changing around 2015. The problems that had always existed in the background, homelessness, property crime, cost of living, began accelerating. And instead of addressing these issues, they metastasized. Homeless encampments spread from isolated areas into business districts. Property crime spiked. Housing costs reached levels that made it impossible for anyone but tech workers to afford living here. And the political response? Well, that's where things get complicated. City leadership implemented progressive policies aimed at addressing inequality and homelessness, increased social services, criminal justice reforms, housing regulations designed to preserve affordability. But here's what nobody wants to admit. Many of these well-intentioned policies created unintended consequences that made the business environment toxic. Property crimes went under-prosecuted. Drug use became de facto decriminalized in many areas. Regulatory burdens on businesses increased dramatically. And the cost of doing business in San Francisco, already the highest in the nation, just kept climbing. Then came the pandemic, and that's when everything broke. 2020. That was the year everything changed. When COVID-19 shut down the world, San Francisco's tech workers did something that forever altered the city's trajectory. They proved they could work from anywhere. Remote work went from a perk to the standard overnight. And suddenly, all those engineers and developers sitting in expensive San Francisco offices realized something profound. They didn't need to be here anymore. Companies watched productivity metrics and made a stunning discovery. Many employees were actually more productive working from home. The expensive office space that cost tens of millions per year in rent, suddenly unnecessary. The perks and amenities designed to keep workers on campus 24/7, obsolete when everyone's working from their living rooms. But it wasn't just about remote work. The pandemic exposed and accelerated problems that had been building for years. With office workers gone, downtown San Francisco descended into chaos. Homeless encampments exploded in size and number. Property crime surged as businesses sat empty. Drug use became rampant in areas that had been safe just months earlier. And tech workers watching from their homes in the suburbs or other states started asking a very reasonable question. Why would I ever go back? Major tech companies started announcing permanent work from home policies. First as temporary pandemic measures, then as permanent arrangements. And that's when the real exodus began. Not just workers leaving the city, entire companies questioning why they needed massive San Francisco footprints at all. The timing was devastating. Just as the pandemic hit, city leadership was dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. A budget shortfall caused by lost tax revenue, surging homelessness with nowhere to put people, rising crime with a police force that was understaffed and demoralized, business owners demanding action while activists demanded different kinds of action. It was a perfect storm of conflicting pressures, and the response satisfied nobody. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this next part because what happened next will be studied in business schools for decades as a case study in urban decline. When the first major tech companies started announcing they were leaving San Francisco, it happened in a cascade that took everyone by surprise. Let's start with the biggest names. Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, announced massive cuts to their San Francisco operations. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space being abandoned. Thousands of employees either transferred to other locations or let go entirely. The company that had been synonymous with San Francisco tech success was pulling back in a dramatic way. Salesforce, the cloud computing giant that literally has a tower named after them dominating the San Francisco skyline, began shedding office space. The Salesforce Tower, that gleaming symbol of tech wealth and power, started seeing entire floors sit empty. The company that had been one of the city's most prominent corporate citizens was quietly downsizing their physical presence by enormous margins. Then came the cascade. Stripe, the payment processing giant, announced they were cutting San Francisco headcount and expanding in lower-cost locations. Uber and Lyft, companies born in San Francisco, began shifting operations elsewhere. Twitter, before and after its acquisition, gutted its San Francisco workforce. Airbnb, Dropbox, and dozens of other household names followed suit, but it wasn't just the household names. Hundreds of smaller companies, the startups and scale-ups that form the backbone of the tech ecosystem, were making similar decisions, moving headquarters to Austin, to Miami, to remote-first models that required no expensive San Francisco real estate at all. And here's what made this exodus so devastating. It wasn't just about one sector. When tech companies leave, they take their vendors, their service providers, their entire ecosystem with them. The law firms that specialized in tech contracts, the recruiting agencies that placed tech talent, the advertising agencies that served tech clients, the restaurants and services that depended on tech workers, all of it started crumbling simultaneously. Some political analysts called it inevitable. Others saw it as a direct rebuke of city leadership. But what nobody could dispute was the message it sent. San Francisco had lost its competitive edge. The city that invented the future couldn't figure out how to manage its present. Now, we need to talk about something that's uncomfortable but absolutely critical to understanding this story. The crime situation that tech companies specifically cited as a major factor in their decision to abandon San Francisco. And I want to be clear, these aren't just statistics or abstract concerns. These are real incidents that happen to real people. Tech company executives spoke publicly, though often anonymously for fear of backlash, about employees being mugged in broad daylight on their way to the office. Car break-ins became so common that it wasn't a question of if your car would be broken into, but when. Retail theft reached levels where major chains simply closed their stores because they couldn't stop the losses. And the most disturbing part, much of this crime went under-prosecuted due to policy decisions about what crimes to prioritize. I want to be balanced here. Crime exists in every major city. But when tech workers start choosing to work from home indefinitely because they don't feel safe commuting to the office, that's a red flag that leadership can't ignore. When companies have to warn employees not to leave anything visible in their cars because break-ins are guaranteed, that's not an acceptable baseline for a world-class city. For tech executives, it wasn't just about the crime itself. It was about the response or lack thereof. Stories circulated about thefts reported to police where officers explained they wouldn't even file a report because the value was under $1,000. Prosecutors declining to charge repeat offenders. A sense that the city had given up on maintaining basic public safety in favor of other priorities. And let's be honest, if you're trying to recruit a brilliant engineer from Boston or Singapore or Bangalore to move to your city, and they spend 5 minutes researching San Francisco crime rates or watching viral videos of brazen thefts, that's not an easy sell. Companies started losing recruiting battles not because of compensation or culture, but because talented people simply didn't want to live here anymore. But crime wasn't the only pressure building on tech companies. Let's talk about the other massive factor, the cost of doing business in San Francisco. And this is where things get really interesting from a policy perspective, because the city has been caught in a fiscal trap that's pushing businesses away while trying to solve budget problems. San Francisco already had some of the highest business taxes in the nation. Commercial rent, that was multiples of what companies would pay in other cities. Regulatory compliance costs that required entire legal departments just to navigate local requirements. And as the city faced budget shortfalls from the pandemic and the early stages of the tech exodus, what did leadership do? They proposed more taxes. Gross receipts taxes, homelessness taxes, propositions that would add new fees and levies on businesses. Each proposal was presented as necessary to fund essential services, including public safety and homelessness programs. But here's the problem. Every new tax proposal sent a signal to companies that the cost of doing business here was only going one direction, up. Meanwhile, Texas was actively courting tech companies with no state income tax and aggressive incentive packages. Florida was doing the same, offering not just lower taxes, but better weather and a more business-friendly regulatory environment. Even traditionally expensive cities like New York were offering special deals to keep companies from leaving. So tech executives were doing the math. Higher taxes plus safety concerns plus employees wanting to leave versus lower costs, no income tax, and eager state officials rolling out the welcome mat. The math was simple, and it didn't favor San Francisco. And it wasn't just taxes. San Francisco's regulatory environment had become suffocating. Permitting processes that took months or years, environmental reviews for basic renovations, labor regulations that increased costs and reduced flexibility, zoning restrictions that made it nearly impossible to build new housing or expand office space. Each regulation individually might have been defensible, but collectively, they created an environment where doing anything was prohibitively difficult and expensive. Now, here's an angle that doesn't get enough attention in the headlines: the human element of this story. We're not just talking about companies moving headquarters. We're talking about tens of thousands of highly skilled professionals whose lives were completely upended, and the hundreds of thousands more whose jobs depended on tech's presence. Think about the tech employee who bought a condo in the Mission District, enrolled their kids in private schools, built a life in San Francisco. Suddenly, they're faced with an impossible choice: uproot everything and follow the company to Austin or Miami, or go full remote from somewhere cheaper, or stay in San Francisco and find a new job, probably at a significant pay cut and maybe requiring them to leave tech entirely. And it's not just the tech employees themselves. Think about the downstream effects. The restaurants in Soma that relied on lunch crowds from nearby tech campuses, gone. The coffee shops that did 60% of their business from morning tech commuters, struggling. The dry cleaners, the gyms, the childcare centers, the services that existed because tech workers were here spending money, all facing existential crises. When a company employs 5,000 people directly, economic studies suggest those jobs support approximately 15,000 additional jobs in the broader economy. So when Meta cuts 2,000 San Francisco positions, that potentially affects 6,000 more jobs indirectly. Multiply that across dozens of companies, and you start to see the scope of the devastation. Real stories emerged of service workers whose entire livelihoods depended on tech. The food truck operator who had a regular spot outside a tech campus, now trying to figure out what to do with a specialized vehicle and business model that no longer works. The boutique gym owner who built their membership base on tech workers willing to pay premium prices, now watching memberships evaporate. The high-end childcare center that catered to tech families, now struggling to fill spots as families leave the city. These are real people dealing with consequences of decisions made in boardrooms and city hall that they had no control over. And here's the cruel irony. Many of the service workers suffering most from the tech exodus are the same people who were told for years that tech wealth would lift all boats. Instead, when tech left, it took the boats with it. So how did San Francisco's political leaders respond to this crisis? Well, let's just say the response was complicated. And by complicated, I mean it was a masterclass in how not to handle an economic emergency. Initial reactions from city leadership ranged from denial to defiance. Some officials insisted this was just a temporary adjustment, that companies would return once the pandemic ended. Others took a more confrontational stance, essentially saying good riddance to companies that didn't want to pay their fair share. Neither approach acknowledged the fundamental problems driving businesses away. As the exodus continued and accelerated, the tone shifted. City officials began trying to woo companies back with new incentive programs and promised reforms. But here's the problem. Trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. When you've spent years implementing policies that businesses say make it impossible to operate, you can't just flip a switch and expect everyone to come back. Different officials proposed different solutions, often contradicting each other. Some wanted to crack down harder on crime and homelessness. Others argued that would criminalize poverty and push the city backwards. Some proposed tax cuts and regulatory relief for businesses. Others insisted that would gut essential services and worsen inequality. The city government seemed paralyzed by these competing visions, unable to form a coherent response. And meanwhile, the exodus continued. Month after month, quarter after quarter, more announcements of companies reducing their San Francisco presence. Each one making the next departure more likely as the ecosystem deteriorated further. City officials found themselves caught between impossible choices. They needed revenue to address homelessness and crime. But the business community was already fleeing, and any new taxes would accelerate that exodus. They needed to improve public safety. But policing and prosecution reforms had become politically fraught, and any traditional law enforcement approach faced immediate pushback from activists and certain voter blocs. The result was a kind of policy paralysis, where problems continued to worsen, because taking meaningful action in any direction would anger powerful constituencies. So leadership issued press releases, formed task forces, commissioned studies, and watched helplessly as the city's economic foundation crumbled. Now, here's where this story goes from concerning to genuinely alarming. The tech exodus triggered a cascade of other failures that are compounding the crisis in ways that make recovery increasingly difficult. Start with commercial real estate. San Francisco's downtown office buildings were built for a different era, when companies needed massive amounts of space for thousands of office workers. With tech companies abandoning those spaces, office vacancy rates in San Francisco have reached historic levels. Some estimates put downtown vacancy above 30%. 30%? That's not a normal market correction, that's a fundamental collapse. And here's where it gets worse: those empty office buildings still have to be financed. Property owners are stuck with massive mortgages on assets that have lost enormous value. Some are defaulting, some are handing the keys back to lenders. But either way, the result is the same: property values plummeting, which means property tax revenues plummeting, which means the city has even less money to address its problems. The retail death spiral has been equally devastating. When office workers disappear, the retailers that serve them close. When retailers close, the neighborhood becomes less attractive and more dangerous. When neighborhoods deteriorate, even more businesses leave. It's a vicious cycle that feeds on itself, and San Francisco is caught in it completely. Tourism, which had been a bright spot, is now suffering too. San Francisco used to be a premier destination. The Golden Gate Bridge, Fisherman's Wharf, cable cars, world-class restaurants. But viral videos of open-air drug markets, brazen thefts, and homeless encampments have damaged the city's image internationally. Convention bookings are down. Hotel occupancy rates have struggled. The hospitality industry that had been a reliable source of jobs and tax revenue is contracting. The wealthy are leaving too. Not just wealthy tech workers, wealthy residents of all types. High earners who can choose where to establish residency are looking at San Francisco's state and local taxes, combined with the declining quality of life, and making rational decisions to leave. And California law makes it relatively easy to establish residency elsewhere while keeping business interests in the state. Nevada, Florida, and Texas have all seen influxes of former San Francisco high earners. Each of these departures removes more tax revenue from the city and state budgets. California relies heavily on income taxes from high earners. The top 1% of taxpayers pay nearly 50% of state income taxes. When those taxpayers leave, it creates budget holes that are difficult to fill without raising taxes on everyone else, which of course makes more people want to leave. Another vicious cycle. Let's talk about what this actually means for everyday people in San Francisco, because this isn't just an abstract economic story. This is about real communities facing real consequences that will be felt for years, possibly decades. If you own property in San Francisco, particularly commercial property or property in areas that depended on tech workers, your investment has likely taken a significant hit. Residential property values in many neighborhoods have declined for the first time in decades. That's not just a number on paper. That's your wealth, your retirement planning, your ability to borrow against that asset. If you run a small business in San Francisco that depended on tech workers or the ecosystem around them, you're probably struggling or already closed. The customers aren't there anymore. The foot traffic has vanished. And unlike big corporations that can pick up and move, small business owners are often trapped. They have leases they can't break, equipment they can't sell, lives that are rooted in place. If you work in a service industry in San Francisco, hospitality, retail, food service, your job is increasingly precarious. Layoffs have been constant. Hours have been cut. Wages have stagnated or declined as businesses struggle. The career ladder that existed when the economy was booming has disappeared. If you're middle class and trying to make it in San Francisco, you're being squeezed from all sides. The cost of living hasn't come down despite the exodus. Housing is still expensive. Groceries are still expensive, everything is still expensive. But job prospects are worse, wages aren't keeping pace, and the city keeps raising taxes to fill budget holes. You're paying more to live in a city that's delivering less. And if you're low income or homeless, despite all the progressive policies supposedly designed to help you, conditions haven't improved. Homelessness has gotten worse, not better. Services are strained. The cycle of poverty and addiction and despair continues uninterrupted, despite billions spent attempting to address it. The psychological impact on the entire city has been profound. San Francisco used to be defined by optimism, innovation, and a sense that this was where the future was being built. Now that identity is gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of decline and dysfunction. Residents who have lived here for decades talk about their city in the past tense, mourning what it was and uncertain about what it will become. So where does San Francisco go from here? That's the multi-billion-dollar question that keeps city officials awake at night. Because here's the harsh reality. The damage has been done, and the question now is whether it can be contained or if we're just at the beginning of a much larger collapse. Other cities are watching San Francisco's crisis very carefully and not out of sympathy. Economic development officials in Texas, Florida, Arizona, and even other California cities are actively using San Francisco's troubles as a recruiting tool. They're reaching out to companies still headquartered here, showing them comparison charts that make San Francisco look like the worst possible place to do business. And it's working. The psychology has shifted fundamentally. San Francisco used to be seen as the place where ambitious people and companies went to succeed. Now it's increasingly viewed as a cautionary tale, a city that had every advantage and squandered it through poor governance and policy mistakes. But is recovery possible? Theoretically, yes. San Francisco still has advantages that are hard to replicate. The Bay Area has incredible universities producing talent. The venture capital ecosystem is still here, though increasingly investing in companies that aren't based in San Francisco. The natural beauty and cultural institutions remain. The physical infrastructure, the airports, the ports, the transit systems, still exist. What's missing is will. Political will to make hard choices that will anger some constituencies. Business will to reinvest in a city that has been hostile to them. Community will to acknowledge that some policies, however well-intentioned, have failed and need to be changed. The path to recovery would require San Francisco to do several things simultaneously. Dramatically improve public safety through both policing and prosecution reform, address homelessness with a combination of services and enforcement, make the city economically competitive through tax and regulatory changes, rebuild trust with the business community through consistent, pro-growth policies, and clean up the physical environment so the city is attractive again. Each of these steps alone is politically fraught. Doing all of them at once while navigating competing political pressures, that requires a level of leadership and courage that San Francisco hasn't shown in years. But without all of these changes, the decline will continue. Companies won't return. Talented workers will continue leaving. Tax revenues will keep falling. Services will degrade further. The spiral will continue. Some urban planning experts believe San Francisco is at a tipping point. If serious changes happen in the next year or two, recovery is possible. If the city continues on its current trajectory much longer, the damage may become irreversible. The ecosystem that made San Francisco special may scatter permanently to other cities, and rebuilding it from scratch could take decades. San Francisco's crisis holds lessons for every major American city, and leaders everywhere should be paying attention. Because what happened here wasn't unique to San Francisco, it was an extreme version of problems that exist in varying degrees in many urban centers. The first lesson: you cannot separate quality of life issues from economic development. Cities that allow crime, homelessness, and disorder to spiral out of control will lose their economic base. Businesses and talented workers have options, and they will exercise them. Compassionate policies toward vulnerable populations cannot come at the expense of basic public safety and order, or you end up helping no one as the entire system collapses. The second lesson: cost matters. Cities can only push taxes and regulations so far before businesses and wealthy individuals decide the burden isn't worth it. There is a breaking point, and San Francisco found it. Other high-tax cities should take note. Your competitive position can erode much faster than you think when residents and businesses have viable alternatives. The third lesson: remote work has permanently changed the calculation. Cities can no longer assume that workers have to be physically present. If your city is expensive and dysfunctional, people will work remotely from somewhere cheaper and better. The leverage has shifted from cities to workers, and cities that don't adapt to this reality will suffer. The fourth lesson: political ideology cannot trump pragmatism. San Francisco implemented progressive policies that had the opposite of their intended effects. Homelessness got worse. Crime increased. Inequality widened. When policies demonstrably fail, doubling down on them because of ideological commitment is a recipe for disaster. Cities need leaders who can acknowledge failure and change course. The fifth lesson: ecosystems are fragile. San Francisco spent decades building a tech ecosystem that became the envy of the world. It unraveled in less than 5 years. You can't just flip a switch and recreate what was lost. Other cities with important industries should take note. You can lose in a few years what took decades to build. So here's what we've uncovered in this investigation. San Francisco's tech exodus wasn't just about companies relocating. It was a symptom of deep structural failures, crime that makes residents feel unsafe, costs that make operations unsustainable, political leadership that has struggled to respond effectively, and most concerning of all, a growing perception that San Francisco is a city in decline. The towers that once housed tens of thousands of tech workers now stand half empty, monuments to what happens when a city loses its competitive edge. But it doesn't have to be the final chapter in San Francisco's story. The question is, what are we going to do about it? This is where you come in. If you live in San Francisco or the Bay Area, this directly affects your future, your property values, your job prospects, your community. If you live elsewhere, this is a cautionary tale about what can happen when cities don't address fundamental problems before they reach a breaking point. I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think San Francisco can turn this around? Are you seeing similar trends in your city? If you were a business leader, would you stay or would you leave? Let's have a real conversation about this in the comments. And if you found this investigation valuable, smash that like button and subscribe to Catelyn Moore because I'm continuing to follow this story and the corporate exodus happening across America. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Remember, change only happens when people pay attention and demand better from their leaders. So share this video, tag your local representatives, and let's make sure this story doesn't get buried under the next news cycle. The future of our cities depends on holding leadership accountable. I'm Catelyn Moore. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.